Hi, and welcome to a video version of Tales from the Gulag. This is a series, my case against the ALP, part 1, an introduction. This is a change from my usual essay style of tales that I've been doing on Facebook. I've been hoping to improve my reach and think that this is important given that within a matter of months we Australians face a federal election which I think, like the world over, will have profound impacts on the future of our country. For those that are new to Tales, perhaps a quick introduction to the Tales from the Gulag might help. The Gulag is a term that is used to denote a network of prisons and labour camps that were used across the Soviet Union to suppress dissent against the regime. It was that place where the naughty people lived who didn't like Lenin or Stalin and their buddies, which is me, because I am one of those naughty people who don't like the left because as a Christian I respect life, property, marriage and the family, free speech, and the left dislikes all of these things and so I'm against them. And so with that quick introduction, let's get on to the topic here, my case against the ALP. This is going to be a series of videos critiquing the national policy platform of the Australian Labor Party from the perspective of one Christian and why I would never support them and why I think that no sane Australian should support them, whether they're Christians or not. The Labor Party's self-description is in its constitution and it says it all. The Australian Labor Party, it says, is a democratic socialist party that has the objective of the democratic socialisation of industry, production, distribution and exchange to the extent necessary to eliminate exploitation and other antisocial features in these fields. Perhaps that might be worth repeating. The Australian Labor Party, it says, it's their words, not mine, is a democratic socialist party and has the objective of the democratic socialisation of industry, production, distribution and exchange to the extent necessary to eliminate exploitation and other antisocial features in these fields. Let's have a think about that. The ALP began with a fair enough purpose. In the 1890s, the shearers of Queensland banded together to protect their rights and conditions at work, and so the Labor Party was formed. But we have to note that the founders of the Labor Party were Catholic, they were Irish Catholics and not atheists, and at that time they were pro-Australia and they were not part of some internationalist movement. That came later. It was in the 1940s, in the period immediately post-World War II, that the party was taken over by the communists and shifted increasingly to the left, so that its original Catholic base eventually left and formed the Democratic Labor Party under Bob Santamaria in 1955. I, for one, was raised in a household that was somewhat dependent on social welfare, and I was pleased when the leftist Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was elected, but then, what did I know? I was just barely out of childhood, but I soon found out. My first ever vote, once I was old enough to vote, was against him, in favour of the Liberal Malcolm Fraser, but then, what did I know? So what changed my mind? Well, for one thing, I became a young Christian, because I looked at what Jesus taught, I looked at what Christianity taught, and so I was there by personal conviction. The state high school that I attended had some excellent teachers, and some of those were even born-again committed Christians, But many of the teachers of that school, including some of mine, were militant atheists and out-and-out Marxists. Meanwhile, as these Marxists were preaching to us about the lovely thoughts of Karl Marx and how great Mao Zedong was and how fantastic their system was, I also began reading books by the likes of Richard Wurmbrand and his Tortured for Christ, and I soon thought, no thanks. And so I voted for Malcolm Fraser and for the Liberals a couple of times, and I found that they were headed in a pretty similar direction as they tried to capture what they call the middle ground. And so my search was for some party that better reflected my values. So what are my preferences, just for the record? I'm obviously strongly critical of the Labor Party. Greens are even worse if that's possible, but they're not likely to form a government, at least not at this point. I stopped voting for the Liberal National Coalition decades ago, and later on, just to be fair, I'll have some words about them. And that leaves me looking at some of the minor parties for which my preference at this point is the Australian Conservatives. And also, just for the record, I'm not some white supremacist. You'll find no burning crosses in my backyard. I'm just a regular Christian guy who wants things like one law for all and equality before the law. Okay? So, let's have a look at Labor's self-description, democratic socialist. The key word is socialist, and, well, what's socialist? It is that doctrine formulated by Marx and Engels that guided revolutionary movements from the mid to late 19th century. In a nutshell, its worldview begins with the idea that history is about conflicts between opposing social forces, where that conflict eventually crystallises into a new force. Classically, the philosopher Hegel, the proponent of this worldview, called it the thesis and the antithesis, and the end result of these conflicts would be the synthesis. For example, 19th century liberal theology applied this worldview in describing a version of early church history as the conflict between Jewish Christianity, the thesis, and Hellenistic Christianity, the antithesis, which resulted in Catholic Christianity, the synthesis. Well, Marx and Engels took hold of this worldview and applied it to economics. The conflict, as he saw it, was that between the capitalists, those who owned the means of production, he also called these the bourgeois, and the workers, and the synthesis of this conflict would be the ideal worker society in which the workers would own the means of production and all would be hunky-dunky and lovey-dovey and all these. This would make a lovely workers' paradise in which all would work according to their ability and everybody would be provided for, as Marx expressed it in his slogan, from each according to their means to each according to their need. Sounds great. To achieve this end, Marx formulated a program in the 1844 work, the Communist Manifesto. This is a fairly short document and is freely available on the internet and well worth a read for all those who are interested in this topic. The Communist Manifesto says that in order to achieve this objective of the worker society, we have to undermine all of those elements that underpin the current system, in particular the traditional family structure and the church. And this is a most important point, and if you can grasp this point, I have already made my case. But let me repeat, the end goal is the state ownership of the means of production by the state, and the state will therefore centrally plan the economy To achieve that end, we therefore also have to destroy the family and the church. The word democratic is the descriptor. It's the window dressing that a particular branch of the socialist movement uses to sell its program to the rest of us. And of course, there are many branches of the socialist movement. Let's have a look at a few. The main manifestation of the movement is Bolshevism, which we more commonly call communism. It's a truly revolutionary branch that gained power in Russia in 1917 and across its empire post-World War II. Adolf Hitler was a socialist. He was not actually a right-winger. So what does the word Nazi mean? It comes from the German words for National Socialist. To Lenin and Stalin, the main conflict was the class warfare between the capitalists and the workers. Hitler's conflict was race, the conflict between the Jews and the Aryans. I'm not suggesting that Hitler necessarily ever read Karl Marx. I'm not suggesting that he was a communist, quite the opposite, obviously. But his vision was the same, of having a centralised state system which would be ruled over and controlled by the Nazi Party, with himself at the head. They're kindred ideologies, an important point. Another one, Mussolini. He was another socialist. Only for him the conflict was nation, as his objective was to try to revive the Roman Empire. And to achieve that ends, he again had to centralise the means of production, state ownership and control over the nation, with the fascist party at the head of the state. And now the more influential branch of socialism today is the democratic socialists. The current democratic socialists use and create divisions to push their cause. It might be, say, ethnic minorities, like, for example, the Aborigines versus the rest of us, or it might be the genders, women versus men, or it might be gays versus straight. These might be genuine divisions within the society that they're trying to reach, or they might be divisions that they themselves whip up. It doesn't really matter. It's still about trying to create or use divisions within society so that they can then use the democratic process to achieve their ultimate ends of the state control of the means of production. These democratic socialists are descendants of a branch of socialism that fled Nazi Germany, and they set themselves up eventually in America via Frankfurt, and it's the so-called Frankfurt School. Check that one out, and you'll be enlightened. This is the dominant school of socialism in our time, and in Labour parties and associated related parties around the world in westernised countries like our own. But you see, the thing is, these are not actually democratic. In fact, they're quite authoritarian, but they prefer to use democratic ends to achieve their objectives, as opposed to the Bolshevists and, say, for example, the Maoists, who use revolutionary means to achieve their ends. It's exactly the same end, exactly the same objective, but the only difference is really one of tactics and how they go about selling their program to the rest of us. So, for instance, the authors of the so-called Safe Schools materials, they're Marxists. The developers of the Australian Workplace Equality Index, which will be used to squeeze conservatives and Christians out of their jobs, they're Marxists. Our mainstream media at home and in the Western world are dominated by Marxists. Hollywood and the entertainment industry is dominated by Marxists. Two of the darlings of the Australian Labor Party, Tanya Plibersek and Penny Wong, are Marxists. Not that many of these people would necessarily describe themselves as Marxist, or let alone have read anything by Karl Marx, but they would have been thoroughly inculcated and indoctrinated by leftist thought and are being used to push the Marxist program. So this is why, for example, the West has seen a steady erosion of marriage and the family ever since, say, the 1960s. Think about that. But for now, let's summarise. The Australian Labor Party is a so-called democratic socialist party committed to implementing Marx's goal of a centrally planned, state-controlled economy. It is therefore a neo-Marxist anti-Christian hate group, and I, as a Christian, have a problem with that. As we go through their national policy platform, I will show that they hate everything that I stand for. They hate my God, they hate human rights, they hate my country, they hate the family, they hate human life. I could never support them, and in this series I'm suggesting to you that whether you are a Christian or not, no sane person can support them either. For all their smiles and all their lovey-dovey talk about equality and fairness, their vision is one of hate against you and me. Thank you.